Hi everyone, welcome to episode 93 of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. Before we begin, I want to take a quick moment to shout out all the new listeners who have just discovered the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I see some of you messaging me on Instagram. I am so glad that the podcast is of value. The guests and the conversations we have are elevating your yoga journey. It makes me so happy to see your messages, your reviews. It really helps validate what we're doing with this podcast. So thank you so much. Now, on today's episode, it's going to be a short, quick one, and it's inspired by the heat wave that we are having in parts of America, in Europe, and probably different parts of the globe. So just thought I would walk you through a quick conversation that is heat wave inspired. So let's get to it. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a six-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Now, I know you must be wondering, what am I talking about? Heatwave inspired episode? So I was one day sitting in my office and looking outside the window, which I do every day because I sit next to a window, and I was looking out and this came to my mind. Do you know in yoga, in asana practice, there are heating poses, cooling poses, and neutral poses? We refer to these as the inner quality or the inner nature of asana. Some poses tend to make you feel warm, even hot inside your body, and they raise your inner core body temperature. Whereas other poses, they do the opposite. Okay, they cool you down and they lower your body temperature. In fact, we can regulate our inner heat through practice like a self-controlled thermostat. So that kind of inspired me to put this episode out there. It's a short one. It's a quick one, just to give you a little bit of background context if you don't already know this. Okay. Again, there are heating poses, there are cooling poses, and there are neutral poses. And knowing this matters because our body changes, where we live changes, climate change is a real thing. So depending on where you're at in your yoga life, this can really serve you. Knowledge of this can really serve you. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk a bit more about all of this in today's episode. There are certain groups of poses that are considered to be heating in nature, that increase your inner Agni, your inner fire. Okay. These categories are standing poses, standing balances, backward bending poses, arm balances, and inversions. Some inversions, not all inversions are heating, some inversions are heating. So the groups of poses that are heating are standing poses, standing balances, backward bending poses, arm balances, and inversions, and some inversions. Okay. Now, the groups that are considered cooling are seated forward extensions, standing forward bends, supine poses, and some inversions, essentially where the head is a little below the heart. Okay. Now, then the third category are neutral poses, poses that are neither heating nor cooling. Okay. And these are largely twisting poses. Okay. Most twists, not some intense twists, but most twists fall under this group of neutral poses, and including practices like Shavasanas. Okay. Now, if you are a beginner, probably everything is heating. Okay, because everything is new, there's a lot of effort. But over time, as you get more skillful in your practice, you can really experience the heating, cooling, and neutral natures of these asanas. So what to aim for in your practice? While this podcast is oversimplifying this conversation, I want to give you a little more thought, just so you can explore this in your own way. Okay. You want to remember never to create too much pitta or heat in your body, especially if you already are someone who is pitta dominant or you have a lot of heat. And if you're wondering what pitta is, please go read up in Ayurveda. That's where you will find more information about this. We've done a couple of dosha episodes as well. So if you already are someone who has too much heat, you don't want to add extra heat. And if the weather outside is very hot, then you don't want to tack on more heat. Okay. So at the same time, you don't want too much cooling in the body either, especially depending on what age group you are in. Okay. For example, if you deal with a lot of seniors, then you don't want to create too much cooling in their body as they already probably feel cold a lot faster. Or if someone is pregnant, you don't want to necessarily do too many cooling poses as that can affect digestion. So just remember that you don't want to swing to either extreme. You don't want to do too much heat. You don't want to do too much cooling. You want to be able to find a balance of the two. And how do you do this? Ideally, you should have learned this from your teachers. They should have taught you this in your teacher trainings, in your sequencing. But if not, there are always more opportunities where you can learn this. Okay. And you can practice with teachers who can explain this to you. But it comes down to knowing when to use what and how much off, and how to change if your class is overheating, how to address that. Okay. So the entire practice is a conversation between the life stages, the goals, the needs of the practice, imbalances in the body, and working towards creating an environment of inner harmony, balance, and peace. Okay. To move to a sattvic state of being. Okay. Again, sattvic state of being, something that you can explore a little more in Ayurveda. Okay. And this expands well beyond asana. Okay. There are pranayamas that are heating in nature, cooling, and then balancing. Okay. So if you are experiencing tremendous heat in summer, you would stay away from heating pranayamas like Bhastrika and Kapalabhati. And you would invest in cooling pranayamas like Brahmari or Shitali, Shitkari or Kaki pranayama or even Nadi Shodhana. Now, if these practices don't make sense to you, we have done episodes before in the past that talk about these, and they'll come up in our pranayama trainings as well. Okay. And if you are someone who is familiar with Ayurveda, then know that there is a huge conversation, okay, or knowledge or wisdom that is available in Ayurveda in terms of food and lifestyle and food habits and eating for your body type, eating for the geography that you're in, the life stage, and the requirements and needs of your life. Okay. So there are foods that are cooling in nature when it's very hot. There are foods that are heating if it's very cold, and Ayurveda goes in depth into this. Okay. So to know more about that, I would send you towards an Ayurveda practitioner or teacher. So to summarize, right, what am I saying? During very hot seasons, avoid intense vinyasa and extreme heat building practices. Practice something that is more cooling and neutral, something that gives you inner harmony. Okay. Remember that your asana, your food habits, your pranayama, they cannot look the same every single day of your life. They have to evolve as you evolve. Okay. You have to have a practice of yoga that evolves as your body changes, as you move through different lifespans. During colder seasons, do a more warming or a heating practice. Okay. And if you have questions about this, just find me on Instagram. I usually publish the podcast on Mondays. Just in that podcast post, ask me your questions. I'm happy to give you a little more clarity. I find this heating, cooling, neutral poses practice conversation fascinating. Okay. But I want to wrap up with this one. I get this question often where people say, but people in India do hot yoga, right? So it should be okay. Firstly, this is a false notion. People in India don't practice hot yoga. Okay. By yoga, I'm referring to asana specifically here. We don't heat up the rooms to practice in them. Another misconception is, a bigger misconception is that India is always hot. Okay. As a climate, it's always hot and humid. Based on where you live in India, you can experience warm to hotter climates. And certain parts of India are actually much cooler throughout the year. And there are parts of India that actually has a lot of snow. So it would be incorrect to assume that all of India is hot all year round. For example, where I grew up, the city was always cool to cold, and we never really experienced extremely hot summers, though that's changing with climate change. Okay. So now coming to yoga. You must realize that in hot weather, at least in India, yoga practices are done very early in the morning, before sunrise or around sunset, when the temperatures are relatively lower. It's not uncommon to have a yoga class at 5 a.m. I used to teach at 5 a.m. And I know in certain yoga shalas or yoga schools, they even start as early as 4 a.m. So just before the temperature gets really hot, or during sundown, sunset time, where things are cooling down again. Okay. The practice is also regulated to be in harmony with the external and internal environments under the guidance of a skilled teacher. Okay. It's very rare that a teacher will ask you to overheat in the peak of summer. Your lifestyle is also set for the temperatures that you live in. For example, the clothes you wear, okay, the food you eat, what you drink, your food habits, all of these, your pranayama practices, they're all related. It's not only about asana, okay? So it wouldn't be entirely correct to crank up the temperature and sweat it out because, somebody told you India is always hot. While the heat can feel very satisfying in your practice, it can also work against you in other ways. So another aspect to contemplate on is whether you think or you've been taught that sweating is a sign of, and I'm doing air quotes here, doing more in your yoga. Okay, this is a false metric, and it seems to be more popular in the modern vinyasa world. It has no validity. Impact of yoga in the long run cannot be measured in how much you, again, air quotes, sweat on your mat. Okay, so just look for greater context and education before agreeing with assumptions you see online. And I hope this gives you a little more context about heat and practice. Okay, so remember, there are heating poses, cooling poses. There are neutralizing poses and practices. They're available in pranayama. They're available in Ayurveda. They're available in your asana practice. And you can really use this to your advantage in your own practice and for those of you who teach. If you are interested in knowing more about this, let me know. I'm happy to do another episode where we dive deeper into this conversation. As always, thank you so much for listening. This one was a short, heat-inspired episode. I will be back next week with another guest and a fascinating conversation that we've lined up for you. Please remember to rate and review the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. And if you have yoga friends who are skipping practice because it's so hot, make sure you send them this episode. I will see you next week. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.